In an economy of increasing scarcity, rehabilitation and reuse of historic fabric will become more and more necessary. Slice is a novel adaptive reuse strategy for large, underused buildings designed to bridge the gap between abandonment and full rehabilitation. These are small strategic occupations to preserve buildings' prominence and value while making a positive urban contribution. This design research project, inspired by a historic building in downtown Providence, was supported by a 2018 grant from the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation. And the two folks who led this project and book are Jonathan Bell and Ian Baldwin, the co-founders and principals of Dual, an architecture firm. So thank you both for being with us. Really excited to hear about this project.
Thanks, Avi, and everybody at Venture Cafe for hosting us today. We're excited to have just wrapped up this research project that, as Avi said, was funded by a 2018 fellowship from the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation. They're an organization based in New York that supports research projects in historic preservation. And we're very grateful to the support they've given us to allow us the time in our practice to research this project and come up with this presentation and a small book, which there's a link to on this page if you're interested in reading more about it. Slice is an adaptive reuse strategy for large underused buildings. Today, we're going to touch on the historical background that has created the need for flexible urban regeneration, suggest the situations that are best suited for the Slice approach, and illustrate Slice's feasibility on a schematic prototypical level, with special attention to code constraints. You may recognize some of these buildings specifically, but that's not really the point. There are many such buildings across the US, and these could be almost anywhere. The point is, they are currently abandoned. These are buildings mostly erected during America's industrial heyday from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, occasioned by the rapid growth of canals, railroads, energy production, influx of skilled labor, large-scale manufacturing efficiencies, elevators, carbon steel framing, fireproofing, large expanses of plate glass, concentration in urban centers, and massive capital investment. You probably know this story. How in the last few decades, the same processes that were unleashed to create these buildings caused their abandonment. Energy became cheaper, manufacturing became much more mechanized, increasing the affordability of technological goods, most notably the automobile. On the city's fringes, the globalization of the economy gradually drained factories and warehouses, while communication networks made it possible to disperse administrative functions away from places of production. Storefronts and commercial districts that had served the communities that arose around these industrial centers were abandoned. Today, after decades of wanton destruction of historic fabric, citizens and lawmakers are recognizing that preservation is broadly desirable for cultural, environmental, and economic reasons. These efforts don't reach everywhere though, and that's where Slice can come in. We were inspired by this little building in downtown Providence on Washington Street. This three-story bookend of a building has clung to the same block in Downcity, Providence since it was built nearly a century ago. George C. Arnold detected that the less than 13-foot deep lot where a hotel had been demolished following the widening of Washington Street in 1895 was encroached upon by the building to the south. Arnold incorporated that building's north wall into his south wall, and this free-of-charge structure may have made this building economically feasible as a trade-off for the big central stairs that had to be cut into the leasable space along Washington Street. The Arnold Building shops and offices were home to typical small-scale services, but the gradual decline of downtown after World War II culminated in the demolition of the buildings to the rear, including the provider of the party wall, when they became less valuable than an asphalt parking lot, which currently sits there today. The Arnold Building survived, perhaps because its shallow stretch along Washington kept it appealing to businesses that needed high visibility and low rent, location, configuration, and orientation. In the early 2000s, the Arnold Building was home to a liquor store, a smoke shop, and a psychic. At least one developer attempted to purchase and demolish the building to enlarge the parking lot behind it. By 2004, the building had passed out of the Arnold family, and its new owner applied for permission to demolish it. The city refused, and following a fire in 2009, eventually took the building by eminent domain. In 2014, a new owner, backed by a nonprofit rehabilitation fund, began renovations. Today, it's home to a French fry takeout, a mobile phone store, and 3 apartments, 2 of which are leased as affordable housing. It's Arnold's minimal square footage storefront activation that inspired our thinking about Slice and how inexpensive, shallow interventions could be beneficial to building owners, tenants, and cities. This active street front is the key to a vibrant community. Consider a photograph of a pre-war commercial district. In addition to the dense pedestrian traffic, there's a remarkable density of activity in and around the building's facades. Signage, fire escapes, awnings, all signal inhabitation by retail, wholesale, and service businesses, many of them small, all dependent on street frontage to see and be seen. When we fail to leverage and maximize the street edges, the energy which has always powered urban commerce is lost. Selective horizontal re-inhabitation is urbanistically, environmentally, and spatially inefficient. If even less square footage than many full-floor tenancies were deployed vertically, however, the architectural and urban externalities would be far more dynamic and positive, and ultimately create the conditions necessary for full building rehabilitation. Slice is simple. It proposes constructing shallow but functional spaces behind a building's public facades on existing floors from top to bottom. This literal front-loading of the building's program creates an active street presence, while the majority of the interior remains walled off and unused. Without the daunting initial investment and operating costs required for a full building rehabilitation, Slice can visually repopulate a large building quickly and cost-effectively, thereby stimulating demand for full occupancy. We also believe that a Slice building will provide regenerative effects on entire urban neighborhoods. To begin reactivation of an underused volume, look to the perimeter where architecture and the city meet. Slice doesn't rely on the facade as a signifier nor dismiss it as decoration. It treats the facade as a thick layer of program. Its inhabited spaces, fully visible from the street, as one cross-section of urban life. This approach allows for renters or buyers smaller floor plates and thus less expensive real estate. For owners and developers, it allows visible inhabitation, quick revenue generation, a staging platform, and living billboard for redevelopment of the entire property. For cities, Slice is a way of revitalizing downtowns with mixed uses in small spaces, creating an interdependent community that resists gentrification. So I'm going to go through a couple of the sort of principles and design tactics when and how you choose a building that is suitable for Slice. Slice uses the thick facade as the visual signifier of capital investment in human inhabitation. It approaches the inhabited facade not as a formal or stylistic issue, but as a spatial, social, and economic issue. Therefore, while it's ideal, but not strictly necessary to have a facade of some architectural distinction, it's critical that the window placement and total glazed area be sufficient to establish a strong visual dialogue with the street. Spatial characteristics of a Slice are generated by pre-existing circumstance. In many cases, the back wall will default to the first line of columns behind the facade, but it can be in a different location on each floor if necessary. And Ian, a little later, will get into the sort of specifics of what's necessary behind the facade to inhabit. An occupied building strengthens the social and economic fabric of the city, and its effect is greater as its location becomes more prominent. Certainly, a Slice can work in smaller buildings in more out-of-the-way locations, but the display case attributes of Slice and its power to create value through seeing and being seen will be best leveraged in central locations with good traffic and pedestrian volumes, in buildings whose scale or architectural stature give them commanding presence. Building services within the building can be implemented opportunistically. This might mean reactivating or repurposing existing pathways or back-of-house locations inside the unused interior. It might mean offloading some of these functions to adjacent buildings. For example, an owner might buy an easement that allows cutting through a party wall to connect each floor to a neighboring building's existing elevator. It might mean constructing circulation towers and service cores outside the building footprint. The best slice locations will accommodate more than one of these possible strategies. So where is good for a slice? In this era that combines economic scarcity, expensive construction, and desire for urban living, rehabilitation and reuse of historic fabric has become obvious and necessary. We have a lot of fabric. More than 60% of the building stock in older cities on the East Coast and Great Lakes was built before 1945. And the share is significant, between 25 and 40%, even in cities like Atlanta, Denver, and Honolulu. Slice was designed as a new model for regeneration in 3 broad settings found within North American urban regions. Certainly, any place can make redevelopment attractive, but the combination of Slice's urban benefits, flexibility, and small footprint make it particularly suited for these particular areas. Ultimately, it may be the eagerness of a place to embrace Slice rather than geography alone that determines its best locations. So the first here is a mill village or a factory town. These communities were more or less self-sufficient, with commercial resources and community institutions within walking distance of the residences, built to house the families of factory workers. Often, most of the village was built and owned by the factory owner, leading to both the predatory, the company store, where workers might become indebted to their employer, and the paternalistic, libraries and schools provided for families, saloons, tightly regulated, maybe non-existent. The shift away from old-fashioned manufacturing has hurt many of these towns, and as losing a dominant industry removes the economic viability. Next, in the medium-sized city, although North America's urbanization continued steadily before and after World War II, the late 20th and early 21st centuries showed a pattern of success for larger cities well adapted for the switch to a national and global service economy, versus industrial and regional cities with smaller and less educated workforces. The Rust Belt across the Midwest has had a number of medium-sized cities affected dramatically, and more recently by the same market forces that drove down the smaller mill towns. And finally, we can look to large cities, but maybe towards their peripheries. Because North America's largest cities have seen continued growth and investment, the 10 largest cities in the US currently account for over 1/4 of the population and over 1/3 of our gross domestic product. The central cores need Slice's attention the least. Industrial outskirts, initially developed to take advantage of less expensive land, often remained undercapitalized within the larger urban catchments. As successful downtowns price out a city's young, its artists, and its low margin and space-intensive businesses, these rent refugees find space in characterful, if raw, buildings in a less central location. So here's how we see Slice as it might work. So here we have an underinhabited, some scattered occupancies here and there in a typical cross section through a city block. Here's the Slice. You begin to reactivate that major street front. You get the elevator back into service, get people on the streets, and slowly that grows. Slice drives a new demand for occupancy, for street activity, and for further build-outs. Until finally, a revived building is the center of civic regeneration.
Thanks, Jonathan. In this plan, is there room for expansion to go deeper into the building?
Yeah, absolutely. We deliberately kept ourselves from going too crazy on that, just because it was really important for us to map out the kind of core idea of it. But yeah, absolutely. And so I think, like Jonathan showed in that last slide, the idea of the Slice starting at the front and then stretching back, maybe independently even floor by floor, to inhabit the rest of the building is actually a really important part of it.
Yeah, ironically, sort of one of the goals of Slice is that it makes itself obsolete after a while and encourages further development, which then means you don't need Slice anymore.
Thanks. And, Dave has a question. Have you looked into opportunities in Pawtucket and Central Falls presented in those communities? And I think it kind of brings up a larger conversation and just to tack on, are you having conversations with developers actively who might be interested in a model like this?
As far as the developers go, I mean, we've certainly had some interest from people who operate in that space. We just haven't, the book was just published in March. So we've been kind of moving this project through our office for the past few years. So it hasn't really been finished until now. So this is part of our great outreach effort now that you guys are very, very generously hosting. So we're hoping that in getting the word out there, we'll get more interest. But as for Jonathan, do you want to talk about Conan Thread and Central Falls and Pawtucket as a potential site?
Sure, yeah, that Conan Thread was one of the first places we went after we received the fellowship. We did sort of photo investigation there and went all around the edge of Pawtucket and Central Falls, looking at potential, and certainly there is. There's some buildings in Woonsocket as well that I think would be well suited to this treatment. But yes, absolutely, Pawtucket and Central Falls were among the first places we thought to look.
Yeah, I would say also, I mean, Rhode Island in general, I think is actually, I don't think we would have come up with this idea if we weren't in Rhode Island, because the combination of just these huge post-industrial building stocks, but also frankly with, we just don't have the capital that a Boston or a New York has. And so, a lot of these buildings have been just kind of sitting around, whereas in those bigger, richer cities, they might have already been converted. So we feel like Rhode Island is actually a perfect testing ground for it.
Yeah, one of the early conversations we had in the course of this project was with a developer in Seattle. And, we presented the idea to him and he was very interested. He's like, yeah, we don't need that here. So yeah, there are certainly cities that really don't need slice, but there certainly are a lot that do.
I'm thinking about the cost to shore up to make this building just inhabitable to begin with, right? Whether it's the foundation, whether it's updating windows and basic infrastructure, the cost of that is oftentimes, a large chunk of a full regular building project. How would one incentivize partners to joining you on a thing like Slice, knowing that if you're only taking up a quarter, it might still be, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Is the cost going to be half the cost of doing a full build out? Or maybe we need to get incentives from local government?
Well, it's both. I mean, so on the macro level, I mean, and this is something that our friend Scott Wolf at GrowSmart Rhode Island has been really has worked hard to sort of continue to make happen. But there's the historic tax credits, which was just extended for another year in Rhode Island. That's incredibly important to getting projects done. And that's sort of a kind of macro issue that's in the background with any kind of reuse project. But as far as the actual costs go, I mean, it's really going to be case by case. And you're right. I mean, if we say, okay, we're just going to rehabilitate 20% of the building, that doesn't mean it's 20% of the cost of a full building rehabilitation. Still, if you radically limit the size of your intervention in the building, it will limit the cost significantly. So maybe actually this is a good time to swing to my part of the presentation and talk about exactly how that's supposed to happen. Okay, so implementation. So yeah, this is how it gets done. I mean, you've heard Jonathan talk about how there's sort of a what I would call a geocultural background to all of this. But this is sort of where we start to get into this idea of how it gets built. As I just mentioned, answering Avi's question, how a project like this gets built is really dependent on the location. But there are some common parameters that we started to map out. The first thing is, just walling off the slice, right? So you have to build a partition, a back wall between the inhabited part of the building, the slice, and the part of the building that's going to be left uninhabited, the unoccupied spaces. So that has to be designed for whatever environmental conditions exist on the other side. So in some sense, it's almost like an exterior wall, but just inside the building envelope. So probably insulated, because probably the rest of the building is not going to be conditioned. Probably fire rated, because the rest of the building may or may not have sprinkler protection. But regardless of what happens, it should not be 100% walled off. There should be sort of access doors that are left in it. And that's obviously for maintenance and inspection of the dark part of the building. But it's also for tenants to maybe use some of that space for storage, which might be really important if you're living in a fairly small space like we're proposing with Slice. Exterior envelope of the building, it's important to say here that Slice is designed for older buildings, and so we don't expect that the whole building will have modern envelope components like an air barrier, vapor retarder, high density insulation. But the inhabited Slice itself will require, you know, a certain amount of weatherproofing, reasonably tight exterior envelope, but the rest of the building doesn't, as long as it can remain protected from water damage. And obviously resist mold growth. That's the most important thing. It also would be, in a lot of cases, make sense to protect that part of the building with what's called a dry sprinkler system, which is a sprinkler system that does not always have water in the pipes and therefore can't freeze in the winter. Circulation and egress. Now this is again of one of these very context dependent things. A lot of older buildings do have vertical circulation that ironically may work for a Slice because they're small. They may not work for current code for the whole building, but as we show in this diagram, if there's a way to kind of tunnel them forward and connect them into the Slice, that's something we could definitely reuse. It's also important to say here, and I'll get into this a bit more in the code part, but depending on which code regime you're using, that there are special historic rehabilitation parts of the code that do make it possible sometimes to reactivate even things like old-fashioned fire escapes as secondary means of egress. And of course, you could always add prefabricated elements like metal stairs on the outside. For building services, so MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, we think a huge advantage to the Slice concept is that because our spaces are so small, they really require much less intensive and much less expensive HVAC equipment to condition them. And this also benefits from a longer trend away from fossil fuel powered boilers and furnaces and toward ductless and mini split system heat pumps, which are not only much more energy efficient and potentially much greener depending on where you source the electricity from, but they also, you know, require a lot less space. And obviously the compressors can be located outside the building or even in the dark part of the building. As far as water and sanitary plumbing, there's all sorts of technology out there now. You know, if you've put a toilet into a basement that's maybe below a sewer line, you may have had to put in an upflush system, which is like a powered system that actually is able to eject that sewage. So we even think it might be possible to put in plumbing without putting in full sort of traditional plumbing systems. And as I mentioned, the dark part of the building could even be used as a heat sink for some of these climate control systems. So this is a code diagram. Now, in the book, there's a whole part of text below the image that sort of maps up to those bubbles with numbers in them. So if you guys are really interested in this, if we have any code geeks in the audience besides me, definitely go to our website. It's right there in the upper left-hand corner. Download the PDF and you can see the sort of the full explanation of the code requirements. But just so everyone knows, we tried to be pretty exhaustive about this. We looked at the International Building Code, which is kind of the standard code for North America that most states, including Rhode Island, adopt and then make a few exceptions to. There's also an International Existing Building Code, which Rhode Island has its own version of. There's the National Fire Protection Association Life Safety Code. And for accessibility, we looked at ANSI 117.1 and the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines that's published by the Justice Department. So 5 different codes in there that we sort of parse to make sure that all of these requirements would work. So we basically just ran 2 scenarios. We looked at a 4-story building with an elevator and without an elevator. This is the with an elevator version. And so we mapped out sort of what we could do with those things in the building. The things you see on the left, that's just showing what the code considers to be the uses for these different types of spaces, and actually how those uses are stacked and what is over what also has an impact on things. And this is the second version of this, which supposes a building that doesn't have an elevator. And we know a lot of historic buildings don't have elevators, or if they do have elevators, they're just so small that they're completely inadequate for modern use. The building I live in has 2 elevator shafts, one of which was the freight elevator, which is big enough to actually now serve as the bedroom for my daughter. But next to that, there's a much smaller one, which is almost like the size of a dumbwaiter, but that was actually the passenger elevator. And it would have only accommodated 1 person at a time. So in buildings like that, where you don't have an easy way to reuse an existing elevator shaft, this is a solution we worked out where by putting the accessible unit on the 2nd floor and adding a chairlift up to it, you can actually keep retail on the ground floor. So one question that came up pretty early in our design process was, how narrow can slice be? So we just started aggregating very basic circulation and spatial elements. Then we added storage, living components, and we finally sort of built up to a minimum size living space. And that's, again, that is by code, by the International Building Code. That's what the International Building Code says is a minimum efficiency unit, 220 square feet. So moving on, we then added to those initial aggregations a prototype for a minimum office. And we found you could even squeeze in a reception area on the left there and a conference room on the right, and in between all the amenities of a typical office that, of course, none of us are working in right now. Sorry, I'm just gonna go back 1 second. This is the and this is the retail ground floor. Now, this is literally where the rubber hits the road. This is really the place where Slice has to perform to generate all the urban benefits that Jonathan was talking about in the previous part of the presentation. So here we added in on the left, there's sort of a newsstand size, sort of micro retail store. On the right, there's sort of a boutique retail store. And then in between them is up to a 25 seat restaurant. And in putting this plan together, we realized that if you add this corridor that you see on the right-hand side and run it out to the side of the building, that gives you service access without interrupting the street front, without sort of disrupting the retail presence on the street. And it also gives you a secondary means of egress, which, although I should say it's actually, secondary egress is actually not even required in ground floor spaces of this size. So next I'm gonna show some renderings. And the reason behind doing these was, again, not to be very prescriptive about the design, not to say this is exactly what it's going to look like, but really just to test our assumptions about if these narrow spaces would in fact work and be pleasant to live in, pleasant to work in. Because, if you look at the plan, it does seem rather constrained, but I think the renderings show that with proximity to light and views, they could actually be very comfortable spaces, very attractive and exciting even, that are well suited for the sorts of programs we find in the city. So all of these have, if you look at the top here, all these have sort of hidden in them somewhere a dimension string. So you can see that the dimension string matches what we had drawn in the plan. So this is our open office space. So you can see the plan of that on the right. And in all of these, I've oriented the plan to be the direction we're facing. So this space and plan on the right is what you're seeing on the left. So that's our open office. Now this is our efficiency unit. So again, 220 square feet. I mean, that's not big. Again, the code calls that an efficiency unit. A lot of us would call it a studio. A developer would probably call it a micro loft. And most units of this size, they typically are turned 90 degrees so that their access to the window creates this sort of much deeper space. And the effect is almost literally like a tunnel with the light at the end of it. But when we take that shoebox and we turn it 90 degrees and we laterally put it up against the windows so that the light and air really access all of the apartment, it just becomes a much more comfortable, attractive space. This is a configuration we did not draw and plan, but we do think it's useful because this view is actually, those black parts are the poche where it's cutting through the back wall. And I think what's great about this rendering is it's showing you how having that sort of access to the city view makes a huge difference. And again, in a space of this size, is just a way to kind of visually expand the space and really make the spaces seem much bigger than they actually are. The other thing to add here is that, so we're envisioning this kind of configuration for residential. The residential units in a slice could easily be expanded just by sort of colonizing or adding rooms on the end of it. And then they could be downsized in the same way. So it's interesting to think about, potential ownership or rental options there, where you might have a rent or a condo fee that's based on a square footage that goes up and down as you sort of use certain spaces, and maybe your neighbors come in and take over those spaces when you no longer want to use them. And finally, this is a rendering of a restaurant from back in the days when we all used to go to restaurants. But it's funny, even though we designed this well before coronavirus, it actually strikes me as being fairly pandemic ready, because you've got this great proximity to the street. You've got a very prominent counter, which would be sort of perfect for picking up to-go orders. There's a large window area, and the way that the seating is arranged kind of spread throughout the space and right next to the windows, it's almost like you could have a sort of sidewalk dining experience on the inside. So that is the almost final slide. This is the final one. And here we have, we can see it's gotten dark outside. So we're gonna wrap up and get your questions. Before I end, I just want to say again, thanks to Avi and Amy and Tootie from Venture Cafe for letting us present this. This is the first time we've presented this virtually. It's the second time we've presented it overall. So appreciate that, and appreciate everyone's patience getting through our inevitable sort of rough patches. Again, thanks to the Fitch Foundation for funding the project. And also I want to say thanks to our many interns who worked on this project starting way back in 2017. So that's Angela Hang, Ricardo Torres-Malicki, Paige Davidson, Aubrey Doherty, Tyler Luke, Lily Fortier, and special thanks to the interns whose graphics you guys have all been seeing. So that's Dan Mangano, Sam Wesselman. This is in fact Sam's very nice nighttime rendering we're looking at now. And Chenyi Zhang, who not only did a whole bunch of graphics work, but did a whole bunch of editorial and production work, and really helped the book come together. And this project definitely wouldn't have happened without her. So with that, I will ask Avi to take over again and see if we have any questions.
Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, so let's check in with everybody. And again, my curious mind is filled with many more thoughts. Obviously, as you mentioned, this is such a ripe concept for Rhode Island, for many of our urban centers in Providence and Woonsocket. And just, were you able to do an assessment of how many buildings, the total number of buildings in this region, you think, or the vacancy rate that exists, like the kind of the need of this?
We started that one summer and gave up because the list wasn't ending. So, it really does. I think, that's ultimately how we came up with the kind of classification of areas where we think, could be right for slice anywhere in the country, really. But yeah, certainly there are a lot of buildings and cities locally in the Rust Belt in the South, the Midwest. So we don't have a specific quantity, and that's changing, by the month. In fact, some of the buildings that, I may have shown in a slide up front may have been rehabilitated by now, which is great. But, there are new buildings that have come online since then as well. So I think it's a moving target, and one that we can't answer definitively, but we do know they're out there and they're everywhere.
And you bring up the fact that this is needed all over the country, and I'm no architect. I'm not reading and involved in the same way you two are. Are there other versions of this concept that are being studied, that have been or that are being executed in any way?
Well, not that we know of. There's one that we know of. So again, I encourage everyone to go look at the book. If you download, one of the things we did not include in our presentation for time was there's a section on case studies at the end of our book. And the Arnold building is in there. There's also this crazily thin building in Pittsburgh, and there's one in Vancouver, which I actually stumbled across a couple years ago. So the historic examples exist. A more contemporary example is this one in Philadelphia called XS House by ISA, Interface Studio Architects. And that's sort of just north of the Vine Street Expressway, sort of in Chinatown in Philadelphia. And that is a super narrow apartment building. What's different about it is that what's not slice-like about it is it's not inserted into an existing building. It was actually built on a parking lot that held a maximum of 2 cars. And yet the designers figured out a way to get, I believe it's an 8-unit apartment building on it. Well, I say apartments, it's apparently just being used right now for Airbnb rentals. But that's the only contemporary example that we came across.
Thank you. Airbnb is a topic for another day. Joanna wrote in the chat, how do you prevent the dark part of the building from degrading if it's not getting the HVAC conditioning that is likely needed?
Sure. I mean, I think I would say it depends more on the building than any kind of universal solution. Like some buildings may have basic, HVAC for maintenance, making sure the sprinkler pipes don't freeze and so forth. There's also the possibility, as Ian mentioned, for new systems to take advantage of unconditioned space to pull and expel heat to and from there. So there's, at least in the short term, an opportunity to take advantage of it. There's a back to sort of Avi's original question at the midpoint about the cost of all this. There's a certain investment that any building owner is going to have to do, which is, as Ian was saying, keep water out of the building. And that would, apply in as far as, making sure things don't freeze as well in unoccupied parts of the building. So there are basic expenses that are going to have to be done to maintain the unused part of the building. But the slice part of the idea of slice is that it is bodies and in the building and eyes on the building. And so problems can be addressed more quickly, and hopefully the entire building reoccupied in a way that it might not be otherwise.
And actually, I can think of a local example of this sort of in-between state. We tend to think of buildings as being either fully renovated and open for business and thriving, or they're these sort of abandoned wrecks. But when we first moved to Providence 11 years ago, we lived at the Promenade, which is part of the Foundry complex. And when we moved in, there was an entire building which had been treated in this way, which had gotten new windows, new roof. But if you looked in the windows, you just saw nothing, basically. There was sort of, in some cases, actually, I remember on the ground floor, it was still sort of a dirt floor. So what they had done is they had basically just secured the building envelope to keep it dry, to basically keep that space on ice. And in fact, after we moved out, I think about maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, they actually converted that building into their second apartment building. So, so there are examples of developers sort of pursuing this strategy of sort of minimizing harm to a building while they're waiting for the capital to build it out.
Especially if there's buildings that the city or state is willing to offload for a pretty reasonable rate at this point.
Yep.
Until the market's ready for it. Brandon, why don't I just go to you? Maybe you can unmute yourself and share your comment.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I was just thinking about, at the end, you mentioned sort of the newfound relevancy of a slice building given the new takeout culture, if you will. And I'm just, you know, I think a lot of times people are talking about how this is sort of quickening the pace of change of, you know, will these jobs come back and what jobs will come back? But I'm thinking about, you know, you're right at the edge of human occupancy. And I'm wondering if you see a role for this adaptive reuse of these historic buildings, but then the really sort of radical reimagining of them without human occupancy, and, you know, a line of strip malls full of robots making burritos because they don't need to be, they don't need the same space as humans. I guess I'm just wondering if that's come into conversation at all.
So I'll sort of take two tacks in answering that if I can. So the first one is to just, you know, and I know you're not, you know, attacking the project, but I mean, it's just to push back a little bit against the phrase at the edge of human occupancy. I think, you know, we did, as you saw in those last slides, we did a fair bit of work in just making sure that our own assumptions held up about these spaces being livable. And I think, you know, the renderings were really, really important in showing that. I do think, you know, I've lived in, I'm sure many of you have lived in some pretty awful spaces that are actually relatively large. But I think, you know, that idea of a space which has this incredible proximity to light and air and views, and is also, you know, in most cases would probably be fairly centrally located, close to a downtown. I think in a lot of ways that's preferable to a lot of what sort of passes as, you know, rental housing or sort of workforce housing right now. So that's the one part. The second part is to sort of embrace this idea. I think it's a great idea. I think it's a wonderful concept. I will tell you that, you know, when you work on a project this long, that's sort of this ambitious, you spend a lot of time sort of considering ideas. And unfortunately, a lot of them, when you're trying to condense them into an 84-page book, have to sort of get left for later. One of those ideas was to have sort of automated robotic building services that could sort of solve our issues around, you know, adding sort of building services to such a small footprint. So one of those ideas that I'm really sad we didn't get to pursue was for vertical transportation using drones. So instead of having to core an elevator shaft into the building, you would just sort of go out to a balcony, you know, in your unit, and you'd punch up something on your smartphone or whatever we're going to have then, and a drone flies up and you get on it and you hold on and it takes you to whatever other floor in the building, or maybe even another building. So that was something that I would have loved to pursue and loved to think about. So I really like the sort of futuristic idea. And if there's a Slice 2.0, I would love to sort of to go there.
I think that's a great place to leave it, thinking about the future and where we're headed. That's really exciting. And I saw that Cass also was kind of thinking about what your next steps are for the future. Any last words?
People out there with ideas about where this might be implemented, please be in touch with us and let us know. You know, as Ian said earlier, we've begun conversations, but which have been made more difficult in the past few months of being remote from everything and everybody. But the book is out there, and our phones are still on. So please reach out and let us know if you have ideas about how we might get this going in the real world.
Yeah, and we would love, and this sort of speaks a little bit to a question that Deb just put in the chat, which has always been ever present, which is how does the sort of managerial financial piece regarding ownership and who pays for it. How does that work? You know, we would love to investigate that, but for this first part of the project, we thought it was really important for us to be architects. You know, we worked, as you can tell, on the sort of urban argument, and then on the architectural argument, and we, you know, put a lot of time into making sure that those pieces worked and that those pieces made sense. We're not developers. We're not, you know, we're not planners. We're not lawyers. We would love to bring people with that expertise on board to make this a stronger project. So we're hoping that happens in the future.
On that note, have you, I'm sure you've discussed this with developers and contractors. What feedback have you gotten so far from them?
Polite interest. I think, you know, like Jonathan mentioned in the beginning, there was, you know, this guy who works in Seattle who said, well, okay, I can't use this because in a city like Seattle, where, you know, the costs and the demand for housing right now are so high, it's probably not something that would take off. I think, you know, so in addition to Rhode Island, I mean, I think the place my mind always goes to for this is sort of the Rust Belt cities of the upper Midwest, where you have this fantastic old building stock, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, you know, Columbus, even parts, you know, I think there's cities all over that, that do have these great buildings that no one really knows quite how to use. And they're just sitting there unused because no one can figure out a way to kind of program the whole building and to finance the whole building. So what we're saying is, hey, you don't have to do that for the whole building. You can enjoy most of the urban benefits of doing that with only 20% of the building occupied.
You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Thank you for hosting us. I'm super excited this has been recorded now. And although I'm sure I'll be cringing when we play it back, but thank you.
You were fantastic.